Well, good afternoon, everybody in Europe, and good morning if you're in the United States of America or South America, or wherever you are in the world. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about our product, LalBrew LoNa, and we're going to talk to some brewers that have used the product in their production process. So I've got some very special guests with me today, and I'm going to announce them in due course. But before I do that, I'm going to go over a few of the specifics of the strain just to update people that may not be up to date with what the strain is, what it's used for, and how it's being created. So what I'm going to do right now is bring up some slides, and we'll go through the specifics of the strain, LalBrew LoNa, and after that, I will bring in our special guests. So without further ado, let me find my slides. Helpful if I start from the beginning, and we're there now. So today I'm going to talk about LalBrew LoNa. That's our new hybrid Saccharomyces cerevisiae strain used for the production of low alcohol beers. Now, if you know anything about the production of low alcohol and no alcohol beers, you'll know that there's two broad approaches for how you might approach a low alcohol beer project. The first of those are mechanical based solutions, which would be based around removing alcohol from a beer that you've already created. And there's various ways of doing that. One way might be falling film evaporators. Another might be reverse osmosis membranes, which is probably the market leader in the mechanical based solutions. The second option that you could go down, second avenue, would be to use biochemical or microbiological techniques to limit alcohol production in the first place. So that might be using special yeasts, and it might be using special yeasts in conjunction with high mash temperatures and optimized grists. In practice, it is also possible to use both of those approaches. So you could use a blended approach to come up with your final low alcohol beer. I'm going to talk today a little bit about biochemical and microbiological solutions for this, because I work for a biotechnology company and not a company that's selling mechanical solutions. So traditionally, there's been several ways in which you could use microbiological based solutions to create low alcohol beer, and there are many challenges associated with those. So LoNa is a maltose negative strain. In the past, there's been plenty of maltose negative strains on the market which have been used to create low alcohol beer. One that really stands out is Saccharomyces lubigi, and as it sounds, it's actually a non-Saccharomyces strain. Most of the strains used for low alcohol beer production traditionally have been, and that may or may not be a problem. In some jurisdictions, you actually need to use Saccharomyces cerevisiae to create something that can actually be labeled as beer. So that's one problem. But also, these aren't yeasts that have been isolated from a brewery environment. They're mostly wild yeasts or food spoilage organisms, and therefore they have some downsides associated with that non-specialized genetic history. Often they're POF positive. They can create quite large numbers of sulfur flavors. And then final point in this, and that's the case for all of these things, you do require to pasteurize the beers after you produce them. So that's one way of making low alcohol beer. You could also use maltotriose negative strains. So these are strains that don't ferment the sugar maltotriose. And when used in conjunction with high temperature mashing or specialized grists, you can actually use those strains to create a low fermentability wort and create a beer that's less than 0.5% alcohol. And that's actually where we started as Lallemand when we recommended creating low alcohol beers, or how to create low alcohol beers. Now that works well, but the problem is that you do need a very high mash temperature to make it work. So high, in fact, that you can quite often have problems with wort processing downstream. Very high mash temperatures tend to cause gloopy and hazy worts, which aren't easy to work with in the brew house or in the cold block either. Another way would be arrested fermentation. So that's kind of what it says in the tin. So that's creating a wort and starting a fermentation and preventing that fermentation from finishing, usually by the application of low temperatures. As you might imagine, techniques like that can be quite inconsistent. It can be quite hard to hit the right point in the fermentation to cool them, and therefore it's quite easy to have over attenuation, have too high an alcohol content, and then have to dilute out that resulting beer to actually hit your ABV target. Final one is cold contact fermentation. So some of you may have heard of this. That's a process where you create a wort and you introduce yeast to that wort at very high cell concentrations and very low temperatures. The idea being that you get some of the beer flavor production, but very little of the alcohol production. The downsides associated with cold contact are actually very similar to those associated with arrested fermentation. So we've seen that there's quite a lot of challenges with creating low alcohol beers by biological methods, and those challenges led to us to have a wish list for a new strain for creating low alcohol beers. So this is just a list of the desired traits that we would like for our low alcohol beer strain. So first of those is that it is a Saccharomyces cerevisiae strain. That just makes sure that there are no problems with using the strain for beer production. You can always label it as a beer. We also wanted to have a cleaner profile, so we didn't want it to create any sulfur flavors. We didn't want it to produce phenolic off flavor. As we've already seen, many of the strains out there already are derived from wild yeast or food spoilage organisms, and they create phenolic off flavor. That's something that was bred out genetically over the years of strain evolution in breweries, so we don't want it to create that flavor. We also want it to reduce worty flavors. Many of the methods that I outlined before can produce worty flavors that you don't want in your final product. We wanted consistent fermentation performance, a simple brewing process. You didn't have too much changes in the hot side of the brewery. And we want it to be versatile. So we want to be able to create lots of different styles with it. Specifically, we don't want it to have really crazy standout flavors that might prevent you from creating cleaner styles of beer, such as a lager. So that's what we've done. LalBrew LoNa has the following attributes, and I'll go through how we created it in the next slide. But we used non-GMO methods to select a strain that doesn't consume maltose or maltotriose and has a very low attenuation. It's the first laboratory strain of its kind that does that, and it doesn't produce any H2S at all, so it produces quite a clean fermentation, and it also reduces many of the staling aldehydes that you'll get in a standard wort, which wouldn't necessarily be reduced in a standard low alcohol fermentation. So this is how it's done. It's a breeding technique. So we start with two parent strains, an Italian wine strain, which has two sets of genomes. 2N signifies that. And this strain doesn't produce H2S. It's technology incorporated into the strain called MET10, which means it can't physically produce any H2S at all. We then cross that with a maltose negative strain to create a parent for our final strain, which is non-H2S, doesn't produce any sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, and can't ferment maltose. And we take that and we cross it with a brewing strain. So what we do there is we introduce real brewing pedigree into the lineage and create a new strain which has brewing-like characteristics because it has had those brewing strain genetics incorporated into its genome. So we end up with a final strain that's maltose negative, doesn't create any H2S, and produces beer-like flavor whilst reducing staling aldehydes. So when we've created a strain like that, we obviously take it to our R&D labs and we verify what we've done in the laboratory to show that the strain does work in practice. And I've just got some data here that shows that. So on the left-hand side, we're really looking at fermentation performance of the strain. And we've compared the LoNa with Saccharomyces cerevisiae, an H. verum, and an S. ludwigi. And you can see the LoNa is also tested in both liquid and in active dried form, so that you can see that the dried form performs in a similar fashion to the liquid form. So on the left-hand side, you can see that the strain efficiently produces alcohol up to about 0.4% in this case, so still coming under the 0.5% that we need for low alcohol beer production. And it also efficiently reduces gravity compared with the other strains that we looked at. So we've got a very fast and very reliable fermentation performance. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see an analysis of the sugars that the strains tested have taken up. And you can see in almost all cases that the strains ferment simple sugars, apart from the Ludwigi, which is not a very good fermentation fermenter. It's not very efficient. Then we also looked at the number of aldehydes that the strain took up. So these are chemicals that cause the wort flavour in beer. During a standard brewing fermentation, those aldehydes would be reduced during the fermentation process and wouldn't be present in the final product. So you wouldn't end up with these worty flavours present. When you're using some of the wild strains out there for brewing fermentations, they don't efficiently reduce these flavours down, and so they can remain at the end of fermentation. So on the left-hand side of the slide here, you can just see some justification for how the LoNa strain performs versus the reference strains, which are Saccharomyces ludwigi that we've used in this case. And you can see that it utilises much more of the aldehydes in the fermentation, and the total aldehydes in the final beer are lower. So that's the end of my slides. I'm going to go back to Crowdcast now. I'm going to invite in our special guests from the Green Room. So joining me today from the Green Room is Sam Green, who's the head brewer at Untitled Arts Brewery, and James Conery, the innovation brewer at Sierra Nevada Brewery. So you guys would like to join me now?
Thanks for having us.
How you guys doing?
Oh, great. I'm glad we're here.
Doing great.
Great. So what I'm going to do is just ask you a few questions now. We'll go through a bit about your backgrounds and a bit about your projects in low alcohol beer production. So who wants to go first?
James.
James.
Me, huh? Okay.
Too, James.
Well,
so, yeah. I think to start with, you could give me just a background on your career so far and what you do at Sierra Nevada.
Sure. I've been in the brewing industry for, 18 years or so.
Right. I've never guessed.
Yeah, been working at Sierra Nevada for 13. I am been fortunate enough to have the super awesome job of being the innovation brewmaster for our company. So I get to work on all the new projects, which is challenging sometimes, much like non-alcoholic beer. I think we started working on a non-alcoholic beer prototype maybe 4 years ago, and went through most of everything you presented, with the exception of the mechanical processing, all the different strains you could think of and different processing or fermentation methodologies, and never really hit on anything that we thought met our internal profile that we were looking for from a beer, from a non-alcoholic beer. So, I mean, once again, this has been pretty exciting for us.
Great. And Sam, can you let us a bit about your background?
Yeah, I've only been in the industry for 17 years, so not as many.
Makes me feel young. This is good.
I win.
But yeah, pretty much kind of similar story. I cut my teeth out in Colorado. I was brewing out in there, and then moved out to Wisconsin for this Untitled Art and Octopi Brewery. And we get the benefit of we're a beverage facility, so we make more than just beer. A lot of that is non-alcoholic, and a lot of Octopi's clients are pursuing non-alcoholics. So I get the benefit as being innovation brewer for Untitled Art to see and get my thumb on the pulse of what everyone else is doing and kind of educate them, and they educate me, and we kind of cohesively learn together. So
great. So we're going to talk a bit about the LoNa strain today, but should we talk a little bit about the low alcohol beer market first? I mean, it's been around for quite a long time, it's fair to say. In Europe, it's maybe a slightly more mature market than it is in the United States. In the United States, it seems to be exploding. Seems to be people coming out with low alcohol beers every week. Given your quite lengthy careers, have you done quite a lot of work in low alcohol beer in the past? Or is this a relatively new thing for you guys? I know, James, you said you've done a bit with Sierra before.
Yeah, it was on and off. We would find a strain of yeast or a new technique and try it, not with any huge success or a lot of energy towards a product. If we felt like something had merit, we would take off with it, and we haven't. The mechanical aspect of any sort of distillation columns or all of those things were just priced us out at the times that we've been working on everything. Not to say that they're not options that can work. There's some really, really good non-alcoholic beers in Europe, and that some people make, some brewers make in the United States, but I mean, they're really expensive. So.
Sam, have you done any work before in the past?
Yeah. So we started kind of similar timeline about 3 or 4 years ago. This is right around the COVID era where it really came to blossom. About people were getting very introspective about how much alcohol they're consuming, and they wanted to right the ship. I mean, myself and some coworkers included, about there's got to be a way to make great tasting non-alcoholic beer out there, because the examples at the time were not very good representations. So our kind of pillar or flag attempt is this needs to be very good for a beer, not very good for a non-alcoholic beer. And so we're lucky enough to have some machinery here and RO membrane filtration that has produced some really great tasting beers. We've also done arrested fermentations. We've tried out different yeast techniques. So we've seen quite a bit, and I don't know a number, but I've probably done like 50 non-alcoholic brews. So a lot.
So you're both veterans. You've done it before.
There's not, it's kind of unique. It's the forefront of the industry. So there's not a lot of people you can glean information from. So it was really nice to talk with James a while back, because they had done a lot of the research up front and saved me a lot of headache and a lot of experimentation, and came up with some good stats and parameters. And that's just allowed us to excel as well.
Right. And so this time around, you went down the microbiological route. Is there a reason that you went for that particular option? Would you do it that way again?
Yeah. So, we were making, again, the mechanical stuff it's a very expensive piece of equipment. Not a lot of other breweries can afford it. That's an attraction for clients to Octopi. But it takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of trickery and mimicry that you have to do. And it was still kind of like, well, what other options are there? And then we kind of heard about this option, wanted to just give it a light test, and then we were pretty happy with the first results. So.
Same question for you, James.
Yeah. I mean, it's other than the mechanical piece, we followed a lot of the same as Sam. I can't remember how I stumbled into the trial when the LoNa yeast was still in your testing phases as an experimental numbered yeast, working with your team. And we tried the arrested fermentations and using Piccia strains and other low alcohol fermentation yeasts. Nothing really met our internal quality standard. To Sam's point, we were really looking for something that was not just a good non-alcoholic beer, but a great beer, and would, that we could confidently put in front of somebody, and it would potentially be hard for them to know if it was alcoholic or not alcoholic. So that's been our bellwether, we're moving forward with that.
Great. So I'm hearing that you've quite enjoyed using the LoNa. How does it compare with other non-sac or other alcohol-free strains that you've used in the past?
For us, it's, I would say for now, the consistency of using it has been the key. For pretty much any of the other yeast, any strains that we had worked with in the past, we've always ran into consistency of fermentation issues. So if you follow good standard brewing practices, we have had no issues at all. I'm trying to remember. Yep, we haven't had any issues with any fermentation parameters yet. Nothing has overrun fermentation or even stuck to a point. It's very consistent with alcohol production, so we know exactly what we're going to get every time, and the flavor profile production. I think another big piece, and like you said, with the breeding program that you had with this strain, a a lot of the previous yeasts that were available have some flaw, either, you know, they're POF positive, or they produce a lot of sulfurs. They can't maybe necessarily mop up and incorporate any wort aldehydes that would be around, that the LoNa strain has seemed to do for us as well.
Great. So I speak to brewers a lot about brewing low alcohol beer, and one of the things that I emphasize with them is it's not just a simple case of writing a recipe and pressing play. You know, you have to do a lot of optimization around the process, the ingredients that you use, the kind of steps that you take in the brew house. Without going into any details that you don't want to share, how did you go about optimizing that process? You know, what did you do with your grist, your mashing, fermentation, and dry hop?
Yeah, so I'll take it. It's kind of, I've said this story so many times, but I liken it to like a song. So when you are drinking a non-alcoholic beer, your mind is kind of queuing up already flavors that are coming to mind. This beautiful balance between sweet and bitter, like a song that you've heard 1,000 times. And when someone hits a note that's wrong, you're frustrated. And that's what's happening in your palate with the lack of alcohol. You're expecting this wave of flavor to come, and there's just a void. And that's usually what tends to making non-alcoholic beers taste very bad, is because you're frustrated. And so you kind of need to rewrite how to kind of fill in this pothole, this little gap that's missing, or what kind of flavors and contexts and sensations are occurring with alcohol, but now we don't have alcohol, and how can we stretch other ingredients to kind of compensate for that? At least that's how we look at it.
That was a very romantic analogy.
I've said that story a few times, so I got it down pretty bad.
Can I steal it?
Yeah, I have at it.
Yeah, I'm just going to use Sam now. Mine's not so eloquent. I mean, for us, it's you know, I think you start with the understanding of what the yeast fundamentally does from a scientific principle, like what makes it a low alcohol fermenter, and understanding the inputs, how you have to treat your hot side all the way through. How do you dry hop? What is the science of dry hopping? Like, what does that mean? How are you extracting the flavor components, the oils and the resins and all the other the goodness from the hops? That's a scientific term there. And how are you extracting that? What are your solvents in your beer that you're either lacking or you know, trying to get in some other method, and then working towards modifying your dry hopping process to make that fit. I would say that it's on the surface, LoNa yeast has made it fairly simple to some degree for us, to be honest. But as soon as you peel the first layer of the onion back, you know, you really need to understand exactly what's happening along each step in order to produce the right flavors that you're looking for. And you know, to Sam's point, build the song right. I'm totally going to steal that now.
Very good.
Thanks.
So you've done all that. Was there any specific problems that you encountered on the way? You know, was there anything that you found really tricky or unexpected? Was unexpected during the process?
In regards to this LoNa, or just non-alcoholic in general?
Probably just non-alcoholic in general. Yeah. I mean, if it includes the LoNa, then great. But just your biggest challenge, what did you have to overcome?
Yeah, I think James kind of alluded to something that bit us a little bit. Is, you know, dry hopping, you're not extracting with the lack of alcohol, you're not extracting certain flavors. So, you know, you think you know how to drive a car, but then when something is taken out of the car, you actually have no idea how to drive the car. So you got to relearn and hit the books and say what's actually going on here. So dry hopping has caused a bit of an issue. That was something to navigate. And then also, you and I were talking earlier, colorant, like expect something to come out black, but since you're going so low on your grist, you got to up your specialty grains, and then it still comes out dark brown, and you just kind of retry, and just pick out 5 things that went wrong, 5 things that you can improve, and then brew it again.
So you've got your process down, and you've got something that tastes great. And something that I have been speaking a lot with brewers about recently is the issue of microstabilization. What did you guys do about that? Did you go down the traditional route? Did you maybe look at some more experimental technologies that are out there? Good, James.
All right. I'll go first. We have just finished commissioning a new packaging line with a tunnel pasteurizer. So for partially for non-alcoholic, but also for other what we call beyond beer products. So our stabilization method has been tunnel pasteurization. There are a few products that are out there just now hitting the market that are not a thermal stabilization, that are extracts of other plants that have been given GRAS status and appear to work. We're still doing R&D on the products, working through our challenge studies with third-party labs on them. And it might, I mean, those can potentially open the window up for draft, because draft non-alcoholic beer obviously is very problematic.
Very similar story, so it's funny. Yeah, we do tunnel pasteurization on all canned units. We have a flash pasteurizer that comes off of the Centro. We have dabbled with preservatives in the past. We're looking for alternatives. It's some very promising stuff, some mushroom alternative preservative. But yeah, it's kind of a serious thing, and I think that's a large barrier to entry for a lot of smaller breweries, is how, yeah, you can make non-alcoholic, and with this strain you can make pretty flavorful non-alcoholic, but how do you ensure that microbially it's safe to consume, it's safe for the consumer, safe for pregnant women, like that kind of stuff. And that's where you put yourself out on an edge. So it's easier with alcohol because it's kind of a given, but control the pH, there's other parameters you can kind of manipulate to make it, put it in good faith, healthy.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that's the area to kind of watch in this sector at the moment, is those innovative solutions that might allow people to enter the market that aren't currently able to. Also, I think smaller size tunnel pasteurizers, that sort of thing, will probably start to appear, just so that there's a market for it. That there's going to be people that want to enter that market, and people will be looking to enable them to do so. So next point, obviously these are very complex problems, very complex R&D problems. The key success of the project is clearly the sensory panel, and how the beers are actually perceived, both in-house and by consumers in the trade. How did you guys go about testing those beers to make sure that they were acceptable, both to you guys and to consumers as well?
So we're on our third Lona attempt, is what we call them, but they've been released to market. The first was an orange peel wit, which again, we were like introductory into this, and talking with James, he gave me like a crash course on the yeast. I was pretty reserved, pretty apprehensive, a non-believer, I guess. And so we wanted to put it in one of our more, zany-esque flavors, where we knew we could overcompensate if something didn't go right with some spices or some orange peel or something like that. And it just wasn't needed at all. We were like, holy cow, this is in a great place. This tastes better than its brethren made the other way. But then when the IPA came up for us, our juicy IPA, we brewed a regular batch and a regular batch at normal strength and a regular batch with Lona. And then we just went side by side. What does this have? I like attributes of this. What does this have? I like attributes of this. This is missing this. We blended the two together, took what we've learned from there. Now we're on full Lona for the IPA as well. And then we just made a stout just recently, and that there's some things that we need to kind of tweak a little bit, but overall very happy with it. So.
Okay.
Well, we're kind of the same vein as Sam. We started out with a few different styles that we tried to see what what the Lona yeast would do, a stout, a citrus wheat, a blonde ale, an IPA. Not surprisingly, our marketing team wanted to push the IPA and the blonde ale from a commercialization perspective, so we have the ability with we have some small pilot can lines, and we have a pilot tunnel pasteurizer. We've been test marketing and just in our local market in town to get customer feedback and consumer feedback from both the blonde and the IPA that we've been looking at doing, and kind of iterative cycles with that. So that's how we've been testing our beers.
It sounds like it's going really well. So you've already got quite extensive ranges of beers, both of you. Do you see a low alcohol range being produced in a similar fashion? Are you going to have quite a few different low alcohol lines? And if you are, would you be looking to use Lona for those as well?
Low alcohol being on its own, or like less than 0.5%?
Less than 0.5, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I keep talking over you, James. We get pretty experimental, so I think we have probably 13 non-alcoholic varietals that we release in full cans. And after the first 2 trials, they kind of gave the green light on most, if not all, the projects. I see there's a lager question on here, which I'm very curious myself too. If you guys are going to make a lager Lona. But yeah, Oktoberfest stouts, IPAs, a couple other, we have a pseudo Mexican lager, and those are all graduating to Lona. And yeah, we plan on releasing those nonstop until somebody says don't make them anymore.
We're similar. We have a lot of things going on, so we haven't done maybe 13 different beers, but we definitely are working on what we would call brand extensions for the family of our non-alcoholic beers, and that's more driven by our commercial team and our commercial end of what they would like to do. If we meet the success criteria, I'm positive we'll be doing other styles of non-alcoholic beer in the future.
Great. Well, that's all the questions I have. So I think what we're going to do now is go for some open questions from the QA section. So I'm going to have a look over it. If you could put your questions in the Q&A section rather than in the chat, that would be really helpful. It would just save me going backwards and forwards and missing anything. So the first question I have, and it's definitely one for me, is there any R&D to do the same for a lager style Lona? So Sam, it sounds like you're interested in this as well. I'm going to disappoint you and say at the moment I don't think we've got anything going on. It's Rich that's asked the question. I suppose what he's getting at is that lager yeast is actually it's a natural hybrid. It's not a Saccharomyces cerevisiae strain. It's a hybrid between 2 strains, Eubionis and Saccharomyces cerevisiae. And along with that comes some unique lager characteristics, which are derived from the Eubionis parent. In the case of the Lona strain, and actually in many strains that are maltose negative, you do actually get quite limited flavor production, mostly because there isn't a great deal of fermentation that happens, and so the metabolites that those strains produce aren't there in great quantities. So at the moment we do recommend the current Lona strain for lager production, purely because it's not going to be kicking out very, very large levels of esters, and therefore won't necessarily come out ale-like or lager-like. It will just be quite neutral. But it's a very interesting question, and there's no reason that we couldn't look at doing that in the future. So that would be my answer to that question. Don't know if I can mark it as read. Maybe Taylor can do that. Got a question about sterile filtration and filtering at 0.5. And I assume that's instead of maybe pasteurizing. Do you guys want to offer some insights on the benefits of pasteurizing over sterile filtration, or I can do it as well?
I mean, I could just say that.
Jump in.
Yeah, I mean, sterile filtration works, to most degrees. However, you still have the issue of putting it in whatever package you're going to put it into. So fillers tend to be some of the more highly prone areas of contamination, or they can be in a brewery. And I'm not saying anybody's bad at what they're doing. It's just because of the open atmosphere and whatnot. It is the nature of fillers. You can have a sterile product, but you run the risk of reinfecting it in your cans in some degree. And so though it can work, that final tunnel pasteurization is really one of the only ways, or like Sam alluded to, another product that is persistent and stable in your liquid, so that you can ensure that your final package is sterile and stable, or at least free of contaminants.
I think that was pretty comprehensive, Sam. I just called you Sam, James, sorry. Pretty comprehensive. I've got a question from Tom, talking about fermentation schedules and temperatures. I can say a bit from our side. So we've tested it mostly at ale fermentation temperatures, so fairly standard 20, 22. And what you find is that you get quite a short, consistent fermentation. So you're really talking somewhere between 2 and 3 days for that fermentation to be completed. You wouldn't leave it beyond that. The risk of having something sat there with complex sugars in it and not very much alcohol is that you could end up with contamination and further fermentation. So really what I would do is ferment it at a fairly standard ale fermentation temperature, and then as soon as it's down, as soon as that fermentation looks like it stopped, I would then chill it and wouldn't leave it any longer. Would you guys like to add anything on that?
No, that's the same for us.
Next question I have from Roger is, do you use normal scale mashing temperatures? I can add a bit on that. What we would suggest is that you go with a low gravity and a higher than normal mashing temperature, but not so high that you start to get processing problems. So when we've worked in the past with maltotriose negative yeast, we would suggest a very high mash temperature, and that can work. But as I mentioned at the start of this webinar, you can end up with very hard to handle worts in the brewery, which just don't behave very well. Is that something you guys found as well?
Yeah, we've actually experimented too without this yeast at doing high mash temperatures, and they're so randomized that there's no control to it. So it's like we're talking 168 or 165. Just you're risking too much, and there's too much that can go wrong. So we use pretty much just a higher but normal temperature, and it's pretty consistent with the LoNa.
Yeah, we're similar. If you get too high, the risk reward is not really worth it.
Yeah. I think I'll provide a bit of context there as well. And the very high mash temperatures are designed to limit the beta amylase activity. And the level of beta amylase activity that you would have in your malt is very dependent on the malt batch, the maltster, the barley variety, all sorts of things. So it's not something that necessarily would give you a consistent result every time.
Mm-hmm.
How does LoNa react to dry hop and biotransformation? Now, that's a very good question. I actually don't have very much data on the biotransformation abilities of the strain. I would suggest that normally I would suggest people dry hop with this on the colder side, so you might see less activity from the strain in the fermenter. Do you guys have an opinion on that?
Yeah, so kind of what James was saying is now you've withdrawn the alcohol, the solvent of the hops, so now you're leaching more plant and grass-like material. So you got to be careful on the dry hop. So dry hop loads that worked on a normal alcohol beer don't necessarily apply. So you got to get a little more creative. Yeah, we do it a little bit colder, make sure everything's clean and clear out of there. And you do get different flavors. Not always positive, not always negative, but
different.
Yeah, we did a Nelson Sauvin double non-alcoholic We're probably the only people that will ever do that in the history of mankind. And the flavors were crazy, like crazy, just like the purest, most intense flavor. And then we dry hopped it again with a different strain. It was not the same at all. So things that applied to a Nelson Sauvignon with alcohol did not apply to a Nelson Sauvignon without alcohol. So it was a cool lesson learned.
That's very interesting. I've got a question on pH drop that's typical during fermentation, which I can answer that one. Because it's quite a limited fermentation, you will see quite a small drop in pH. And that's particularly the case because you've got less strong worts, so the buffering capacity of those worts is less, but you don't see much of a pH drop during the fermentation process. What we would suggest is that you alter that pH, and that in itself is an opportunity to play around with the flavor that you might produce by using different acids in that process. So yeah, it might be kind of people's first thought to throw in lactic acid because that's what they have lying around in the brewery, but there's no necessity to use that particular acid. You could use citric acid, you could use malic acid, you could use sulfuric acid, hydrochloric acid, anything that is soluble. Don't use tartaric acid because that might fall out. But yeah, you can play around with the pH drop and with the acids that you use, but it's just important, both from a food safety perspective and from a stability perspective, that you do adjust that pH downwards. You guys have anything to add on that?
No, I mean, that's exactly what we have found and continue to iterate on with our work.
I got another question about brewing kvass with the beer. That's a drink made from fermented bread, I believe. It ferments glucose. If there's glucose present, it'd probably work. I don't have any R&D data that would suggest what it might behave like, but it would probably work. Next question from Patrick. I know Patrick. Have you had any issues with hop creep? And if so, how do you take that into account with the OG, or do you handle it in another way? I would suggest to you, Patrick, that you look at alternative ways of getting the hop into the beer. So I might look at downstream hop products or products which are enriched and therefore have less risk of introducing live enzymes into the products and causing hop creep. So I would probably look at using some sort of extract or downstream hop product. It's not to say that's the only way of doing it. It's probably the way that I would approach it. Have you guys thought about other ways?
We got big time burned on hop creep on one of them. We made the IPA, everything was set, kind of tied a bow on it, put in hops, didn't look back at it, came back a couple days later. It was like a dog that got out the front door. Like, whoa, what just happened here? And then it's like, oh yeah, shoot. So we learned a lesson pretty quickly on that one. Luckily, we were able to get it back under control. But yeah, we did experience some hop creep issue. So.
We've had the same. It's really understanding what variety you're adding, how that specifically interacts, like Sam alluded to before, what the components of the hop is that you're looking to extract, and then figuring out how you're going to approach that in a way that's not going to give you a bunch of enzymes during active fermentation. And yeah, using potentially downstream products or enriched products.
Great. I've got a question about dry hopping levels, and if you can give some idea of the kind of rates that you use. If that's a commercial secret, then you don't need to tell me. I'd probably suggest that when you're brewing these beers, you play around and try and find out the optimum level for you. Certainly in the case of bitterness, you do not want them to be very bitter because there's so little there that you don't want to unbalance those beers. I imagine it's probably the same for dry hop. I think you could probably overdo it. Do you guys have an opinion on that?
Yeah, 4 pounds per barrel is too much. So.
Okay. That's your limit. That's the ceiling.
That's it, absolutely. There might be.
Yeah, I think for us, we typically we've been doing slightly under what we would for our standard production dry hopping rates.
Same.
I'm going through the questions. I'm probably going to make this the last question, and anything else we can try and answer by email. I'm going to try and find a good one. Not that they're not all good; they're all good, but I want to find one that's a discussion point. That's a good, interesting one. Okay. Regarding grist, are you guys looking at doing all malt grists, or are you looking to impact the aldehyde flavor by playing around with those grists to introduce non-malt cereals into them? Would that have an impact? And if so, would it be a good way of a good strategy of looking at reducing those aldehydes down?
Yes, and yes, and yes, I think. We've for us, we definitely have and we will make all malt products, but depending on what kind of beer style you're looking for, you know, or mouthfeel, we've done some of our citrus wheat has wheat malt in there. We do, you know, we've used oats and some other products for just a flavor, mouthfeel, body kind of a scenario. So I don't think it's necessary with the LoNa yeast. I mean, you obviously want to look at your boil profile. That's a really, really big one that you're going to want to just pay attention to, and how you're treating your brews all the way through, reducing thermal loading as much as you can through the process, or a thermal stress as soon as you're out of the kettle, or even in the kettle, depending on how your boils look and you know the parameters there. That all really plays into the downstream finished product of your non-alcoholic beer, and what you're gonna taste and get out of it.
Yep.
Great.
Same.
Thanks, James. I think that was a very comprehensive answer. So I think that's probably us about done. We're going to wrap it up. But thanks very much for your time. It's really appreciated. And thanks also for being great trial partners. We'll definitely be speaking to you again for future R&D projects. So I'm going to end the webinar now. But before I do, just thanks again to James from Sierra Nevada and Sam. So thanks very much, and good evening, good morning all.